Right, I'll start. So, if you ask any expert in genealogy what's the best way to construct your family tree, they'll tell you, well, you start with yourself, your mother and your father, 4 grandparents, and you take it from there. You create a pedigree for yourself, you work backwards to encompass all your ancestors, reaching back as far as you can in time. I think we've all heard that many times. But that's not my story. I started right in the middle of my family tree, and I worked forwards and backwards and sideways, and I added information wherever I happened to stumble upon it, and somehow eventually I came up with the story that I'm going to tell you today. Tonight I'm first going to give you a short account of the haphazard and bizarre journey I had to get to where I am now with my own family history, and the way that how it turned into a one-name study. By accident. I had no idea there was such a thing as a one-name study until I was 10 or 20 years into this. But this appears to be what I have created. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Busteed family in Cork over the centuries based on my research, and finally then I will just give you a reflection on the approach that I took and the tools that I used, because I kind of feel I made a lot of this up as I went along because there was no plan. But first of all, my own background. I actually was born and I grew up in Galway. Now, my father, Brenton Busteed, was a Cork man. He was from Blackrock Road, and my mother came from County Mayo. And we were the only Busteed family in Galway when I was growing up. And it seemed like my father and his brothers and sisters were the only Busteeds in the world. I mean, we certainly weren't aware of any other Busteed family. Now, when I was growing up, Galway was a very monocultural society, and everybody there was either native Irish or Anglo-Norman descent. There were no Protestants at all. Cromwell never crossed the Shannon, so they never arrived. And there were very, very few weird names like ours. Now, our family was Catholic, just like everybody else, but our name was considered English or other in not a good way. And I was a little bit embarrassed by my name growing up because of that. And my mother, who was a Ryan, certainly was very embarrassed by it. And she wished that she was born in a generation afterwards where she would have had the option to keep her maiden name, but I had that option, but she didn't. And we always felt that our surname was a little bit odd and a bit different, but always a bit of a complex about it. My father, Brendan, was the eldest son of John Busteed, who was Professor of Economics at UCC from 1924 until his death in 1964. And he died before I was born, so I never met him. But my dad, being the eldest son, inherited all of his father's books and papers when he died. And amongst the papers in my father's study was a box labelled Busteed Family History. I was always vaguely aware that my grandfather had done some genealogical research, but I don't think my dad ever opened that box. But I saw the label on it, and I think I was about 14 or 15, when I persuaded him to let me have a look through to see what was in there. And out fell a sheaf of handwritten pages with lots of unconnected bits of genealogical information. And the sources were mainly 1700s and very early 1800s. There were details of early wills, land deeds, marriage license agreements, loads of Cork Corporation records, and details of our coat of arms, and lots of incidentals. But one of the most interesting documents was Busteed family tree, which you can't see at all there. But luckily I brought a hard copy with me, and you can't see this one either. This was a tree that my grandfather created. There's 53 individuals on it. And the interesting thing about this tree is that there's all sorts of little annotations, and you can not even see there, and that he's put interesting little bits and pieces on this tree, so it's very interesting to read as a novice, as I was then. It starts at about 1600, it peters out at about shortly after 1800, so there's no direct connection to me, but I was absolutely fascinated. When I placed this together with the other documents that I discovered that historically the Busteed family were wealthy Protestant landowners in Cork. I hadn't realised this. We were prominent businessmen. 2 of us were Lord Mayors of Cork. 1 of us was an MP, and we even had our own castle, Mount Long, in Oyster Haven. And this was not at all what I'd been expecting. I was horrified and I was fascinated to equal measure. Because this was just so different to the identity of being an Irish person that I had from my school history. I just couldn't believe this was my background. And I just really wanted to find out more about it. But the jewel in the crown was a foolscap page, again in my grandfather's writing, an oral history taken in 1727 by William Busteed, later to become Mayor of Cork, from his granduncle Giles Busteed. That's it. And old John Busteed came over from Tewkesbury, a corporation town in Gloucestershire, with his family between the Sovereign Rocks into the harbour of Oysterhaven near Kinsale, sometime before the rebellion of 1641, and inhabited Gurtmalire on the Blackwater side near Mallow, where he had a copyhold. He brought over with him 5 sons and 2 daughters. The names of the said sons was Giles, Richard, William, twins, John and Thomas. The names of the said daughter he does not remember, but that the eldest was married to Mr. Philip Rains of Mallow and the other to Mr. John Brooks of Mallow. So it goes on. Giles, the eldest son, said old John Busteed purchased Mount Long of a sergeant and 8 soldiers of Oliver Cromwell's army. So you can imagine how this sounded to me, reading this as a 15-year-old, having learned about Cromwell at school. William settled at Ballycrone in Imachilly, afterwards removed to Blackrock. Richard settled at Ballynure near Blackrock. John settled at Killingly, and Thomas died young. The characters of the above 4 brothers, one of them was good at home and abroad. The second was neither good at home nor abroad, which was Richard. The third was good at home and not abroad, and the fourth was good abroad and not at home. So this was the document that really sparked my passion for genealogy, and I had to know more about my completely unexpected and totally unfamiliar family heritage. But this was the early 1980s, and access to genealogical information was very limited, and I was 15. So my naive plan was that if I could just gather all the information about all the Busteeds in Ireland over the centuries, I could put it together like a big jigsaw puzzle and I could figure it out. And if we were all descendants of old John Busteed who came over from Gloucestershire, there couldn't be that many of us, so it would have to be very straightforward, surely. And funnily enough, I was less interested in tying down my own pedigree than I was in trying to put together a narrative based on the overall Busteed family in Cork, so that I could understand the culture that was so alien to me at this time. I mean, Galway was a very different place, I'd say, to grow up than to Cork, because I mean, at least here there's a lot of colonial history that's, in your face all the time. I mean, all the street names and everything. In Galway, we just didn't have that. And although I used to visit Cork even as a child quite a lot because my grandmother lived here, but I could see it's culturally very different. So anyway, to move on, so then where was I to go from there? The phone book. As you'll remember, in the 1980s we had 2 phone books, one for Dublin, one for the rest of the country. And so I looked those up. I found my father and my uncle and 2 other Busteeds. And one of them was Tom Busteed from Rosie's Pub in Carrigaline. The other one was Abraham Busteed in Bandon. So I wrote a letter to both of them, because helpfully their addresses were also in the phone book. And I gave a little bit of background about my own family. I asked them why they related, or could they give me some information about their own Busteed family trees. So they both gave very nice, courteous replies, and neither of them had any connection to my family as far as they knew, but they both they told me a little bit about the previous few generations of their own families, but they weren't related to each other either, so this was a bit of a conundrum. I really wasn't expecting this. But Abraham sent me the address of a Paul Busteed in Tennessee, who had been over to check out his roots a few years beforehand. So this was my first piece of luck, because I wrote to Paul, same letter, and he wrote, his wife wrote back to me enclosing a whole lot of genealogical information that she had researched professionally in Dublin. So this was full of baptism and marriage records. This was 19th century stuff. We had Tide, Plotman and Griffith's valuations. I didn't know anything about those. So like it was like another chapter of the family tree. So I had the 1700s from what my grandfather did. 1800s were here. The 1900s were what Abraham and Tom were able to give me. So still there was none of the pieces were matching up. So I established then that the main area of residence of the Busteed family, of at least one of the Busteed families, was the triangle between Carrigaline, Crosshaven and Kinsale. So my aunt, my Ethna, she's my father's sister, still lives in Crosshaven. And she was married to a Protestant, which turned out to be very useful. So she kind of knew the score there. So she and I visited all the rectors and the local parishes and to get the family history, the parish registers, and they were all very obliging. And this was before everybody was doing it. And so we also tramped through all the graveyards, and I visited Cork quite often around those years. So I suppose I was coming into my 20s at that stage. And the Cork Library, Cork County Library, proved a better resource for what I was looking for than the Galway Library. And so I was finding Busteeds everywhere I looked, but I was not making links. And this became very frustrating because I had so much information and it just wasn't coming together. Then I got a letter from another American Busteed, Bob Busteed, who was a distant cousin to Tom Busteed of Carrigaline. And Bob's family had left Carrigaline for Nebraska 3 or 4 generations ago, and there was a huge tribe of them in Nebraska, I discovered. And he had already carried out some of his own genealogical research and was able to present me with 7 or 8 American family trees of 3 or 4 generations. But the amazing thing about that was every single one of them connected back to Cork. Every single one. So I was very surprised about that. But then another couple of years passed, so I suppose we were into the 90s at this stage now, and Kerry Busteed from Newcastle in Australia made contact with me. And he was able to tell me that there were 3 Australian Busteed families that had emigrated from Cork, and the Australian records are absolutely fabulous, and he had nailed down the entire story for those 3 families. And there's a huge number of Busteeds in Australia, but they're all from these 3 roots. So by now I was drowning in information, and I had no clue how to put the pieces of the jigsaw together, or even how to collate my information. I didn't know what was where. I had loads of handwritten family trees, and unconnected to one another, that were compiled both by myself and by all the other researchers. And we were still corresponding by post, at this stage. And so my next stroke of luck was when, in the 1990s, early 1990s, my father retired. And he was a civil engineer and the director of consulting engineers in Galway, but unbelievably he had never used a computer in his entire career. So his retirement project was going to be to learn how to use a PC. So I said to him, I have the perfect project here, type all this up. And he said, okay, I will. So anyway, he brought his PC and he set down with all my huge sheet of papers, and he got the genealogy book, and he became more enthusiastic. I mean, I suppose at that stage I was doing other stuff. I was kind of starting my own career and I was busy, but he just took it over. So with his free travel, he went every Friday for a number of years to Dublin, to the National Archives, to the National Library, Registry of Deeds, wherever, and he started to collect the information that we were missing, because I hadn't really been to those places. And not only did he type it all up, he started. You can't see these. Well, maybe it's good enough for what I want to say. He created our Generation 2 family trees, which, as you can see, this is done actually on Word, which was painstakingly slow, but I mean, he figured it all out, which was very impressive for somebody that had never used a computer before. But he used the same sort of style as his own father had used, and he put in all the interesting little bits and pieces underneath the individuals as he had them, so it's actually quite interesting to read. So he made, I suppose he made 10 or 15 of these for all the various branches that we were aware of at that stage. Around this time, we made contact with Bill Busteed, who was a 7th generation Canadian Busteed, whose ancestor had emigrated from Cork in 1754. And he was another enthusiastic genealogist with lots of Canadian records, and he had a well-researched Canadian family tree as well. At this stage, the internet was becoming accessible, and we were in the late 90s, and suddenly there was new relevant information online as well. My father learned to use the internet, as did I. And the digitised civil registration records and census records and the registry of deeds records were all there for us, and they were particularly welcome and gave our research a great boost. And not to mention the ease of exchanging information by email with all the other researchers. And from the early 2000s onwards, many of the American and Australian Busteeds visited Cork to walk in the footsteps of their ancestors, and a great social connection and many friendships developed because of their connection with the Irish and the overseas Busteed families. And it was beginning to dawn on us, look, we actually are all related. Cork is where it's at. We all have this common connection to Cork, and we never did find any Busteed anywhere that didn't have a connection to Cork, even though we had trouble linking them in to where exactly they fitted in the comp. But Cork was always the pin. So in 2016, my dad was getting older, and in 2016 he was 89, and I organised an international Busteed gathering over a weekend in June, which was based at the Trident Hotel in Kinsale and the Tracton Arts and Community Centre. And we had 165 Busteeds and Busteed descendants at that. About a third of those had come from abroad, mainly America, but there was a good contingent from Australia as well, and we had some Canadians. And we had an amazing weekend. It was really, really successful. We had a genealogical exhibition and lectures. We had a graveyard tour. This is the group of 165. We had a tour of Mount Long Castle, and this is all of us outside Mount Long Castle. I don't know if you know where that is, on Oyster Haven. It's very remote, but it was built in 1631. I'll tell you a bit more about it later on, but it's a ruin, obviously, but it's a beautiful ruin. And the Americans and the Australians in particular were very, very impressed by that. One of the highlights of the tour, well, there were lots of highlights of the tour, but we had a reception at City Hall hosted by the Lord Mayor of the day, and that was facilitated by Cork Genealogical Society, and particularly Eddie there organised that with the Lord Mayor. And the reception was in commemoration of our two Busteed mayors, who were mayors in 1752 and 1799. There was Michael and William, and I think William was the father, Michael was the son. So here we are. So you won't be able to see that. So, but this is the council chamber, and in the middle here you have that's council, our mayor, Lord Mayor Chris O'Leary at the time. On the left side here now, that's me, and on the right, that's Eddie Wallace. So I just thought it was worth putting this in. This here, working from left to right, this is Bob Busteed from Canada, Kerry Busteed from Australia, Brendan, my dad, myself, and Bob Busteed from Nebraska. So, what a thrill it was just to have us all in one place at one time. For me and for my dad, the Busteed gathering in Kinsale was the culmination of all our genealogical work together, and it was also a tribute to the work of my grandfather. And it was amazing to gather together 165 people from the Busteed diaspora from 3 continents to celebrate our shared heritage. And my dad died in 2019, and I know that that weekend was one of the most memorable events for him in his latter years. So I was so glad I did it. We had another Busteed gathering in 2024 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, hosted by Bob there in the red t-shirt. And this was a lower key affair. I suppose it wasn't so attractive. This was attractive because everybody felt they were coming home. But there was about 50 people there. I was speaking at the event, and that gave me the incentive to try to consolidate the Busteed family tree finally and try and present it as a single unit. So that's it. But I'll tell you in a little while. So going back to the Busteed family in Cork, I need to go back a little bit further. As far back as I can go, it's probable that the male Busteed line originated in France, from where it migrated to England probably during or after the Norman conquest of Britain by William, Duke of Normandy in 1066. But the earliest known record of the Busteed family is in 1522 in Sevenhampton, which is a beautiful little village in the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire in the west of England. And this John Busteed was recorded in the military survey of Gloucester in this year, 1522. His property was valued at £3 and he was deemed able to undertake military services. So prior to the Reformation, the Busteeds were tenant farmers on the lands of Sevenhampton Manor, which were owned by the church. But gradually, as the church's lands were seized by the Crown, the tenants got opportunities to purchase their land, and a Richard Busteed in 1590 was granted a copyhold by the landlord, who was Thomas Throckmorton. And this land passed through 3 generations of Busteeds. The family continued to live and to grow in Sevenhampton and the surrounding parishes until the end of the 1600s. And then, mysteriously, the Busteed name disappeared from the area. So between 1600 and 1800, there's random references to various Busteeds in various parts of England. But after that, nothing. And I mean, we can only assume that the name either died out naturally, but more likely that the spelling changed, and that we just haven't been able to make the link. But luckily for me, anyway, that there was one member of the Gloucestershire Busteed family that took a different path in life, and this is our old John Busteed, who left his rural English home with his family sometime after the year 1600 to settle in Ireland. And after a shaky start, the Irish Busteeds prospered and grew to the extent that, as far as I can tell, as I say, that all the Busteeds worldwide today can claim to be descended from old John Busteed, which sounds kind of incredible, but I keep questioning myself, but I can't see any other descendants anywhere. So the Munster plantation is where we go next. The British plantation, as you know, by Queen Elizabeth, who reigned from 1556 to 1603, and she wanted to have the firm control of Ireland because she feared that her enemy, King Philip of Spain, was going to send forces to Ireland and use them to attack England. So her strategy was to confiscate the land of the Irish chieftains and to send English settlers to Ireland to keep the Gaelic lands and chiefs under control. So confiscated lands in the province of Munster were granted to Queen Elizabeth's faithful supporters and military officers, and the Englishmen to whom the lands were granted undertook to bring in English tenants to build defences, cultivate the land in the English manner, and to provide soldiers for defence. So towards the end of the 16th century, hundreds of English farmers were recruited to resettle in Ireland, no doubt tempted by promises of land tenure and better opportunities. I think things were probably very uncomfortable after the Reformation as well in England, and it was a chance to get out and do a little bit better for yourself. And a significant proportion of the farmers were recruited here for the Munster plantation were from the south of England, the southwest of England, where the land was fertile and the farming practices were relatively advanced. And I think that possibly John Busteed, who came to Ireland, was recruited by the Lord of the Manor in Sevenhampton, Sir Thomas Throckmorton, who was connected through marriage with Sir Walter Raleigh, who found favour with the Queen because of his seafaring exploits, and he was granted 40,000 acres in Waterford and Cork. Now, he sold on most of his estates to Sir Richard Boyle, the first Earl of Cork, in 1602. And the earliest record of the Busteed family in Ireland is mentioned in the State Papers of Ireland of John Busteed, one of 522 English tenants and inhabitants of Sir Richard Boyle's plantation in 1611. So, you know, they emigrated for better opportunities. They were not a moneyed family, not at that point anyway. The family initially settled in Girtnalyre near Mallow, where they had a copyhold, which is a grant of 100 acres with an obligation to undertake military services if required. And by 1641, the year of the rebellion, Giles, Richard, William and John had sizable farms nearby, around Doneraile and Buttermont. But in the 1641 rebellion, the four Busteed brothers were run out of their properties by the rebels, which was only 30 years after they arrived. I don't know how many of you come across the 1641 depositions, but they are a fascinating group of they comprise 3,000 personal statements or depositions of Protestant women and men of all classes made following the outbreak of the rebellion by Catholic Irish in October 1641. And the purpose of gathering this information was to be used in evidence in subsequent trials of the rebellion leaders, but also to provide a vehicle for compensation of the Protestants who had lost their lands. And so one of the highlights of my genealogy journey, if you like, was sometime in the mid-1990s. I went to Dublin myself to research, to do some research, and I ended up in Trinity College where the depositions are held. I asked to see them, and to my amazement, the librarian put on his gloves and went away and brought out the originals. So I have here just the text on the deposition of John Busteed, the 30th of May 1642. So John Busteed is my 8th great-grandfather. So it says, John Busteed, late of Girtnalyre in the parish of Kilshanny and Baron of Duhallow and County of Cork, yeoman, British Protestant, duly sworn and examined before us, deposed and saith that on about the 10th of December last, he lost and was robbed and forcibly despoiled of all his goods and chattels worth £216 5 shillings. Part consisting of a debt owing of cows, sheep, horses and mares to the value of £142 sterling, of household stuff to the value of £5 sterling. He further saith that by means of this rebellion the deponent was expelled and driven away from his said farm of Girtnalyre and house where he left in corn in ground to the value of £6 sterling. So that is a lovely personal connection for me that I can trace right back to that. Although it was obviously a traumatic period for all involved. In 1649, King Charles I was executed, and Oliver Cromwell and his army carried out a savage campaign in Ireland with the intention of subduing the rebellion and stamping out all the opposition to Parliament. And much of the land in Cork which belonged to the Loyalist supporters was forfeited and sold and granted to Cromwellian supporters. And it would appear that the four Busteed brothers benefited from this arrangement, as each of them subsequently acquired land in South Cork at this time and settled there. So what happened after the four brothers moved south? Well, two of old John's sons, Giles and John, attained significant wealth and left a significant number of descendants through their male line. But the estate of the other brothers was lost to the Busteed family within a few generations due to the failure of the male line. A few daughters, but that was about it. Now, the Giles Busteed dynasty continued for another 4 generations, and then the Busteed surname disappeared there. at that stage. But his brother John produced a greater number of male descendants, and I believe that all the Busteeds that are still called Busteed in the world are descendants of this John. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Giles first of all. As I said before, I think, in 1659 Giles purchased Mount Long Castle and the extensive associated lands in the thousands of acres at Oyster Haven near Kinsale. And that's Mount Long Castle, as I say, absolutely beautiful. It's situated right next to a farmyard there, and it's right in the farmyard actually. And most beautiful situation there, it's on the Bandon River. Mount Long was built in 1631 by John Long, who's a royalist supporter who was captured and executed in 1653. And according to the local tradition, the castle itself was burned by Long's daughter rather than let it be taken once her father had been defeated. It has actually been a ruin ever since that, in 1641, and it lost its roof at that stage. And I mean, it's just incredible that it's still standing 400 years later. You can actually see there's timber lintels on the windows that are charred presumably from the fire when it was burnt out in 1641. Now, I mean, every time I go near it, I feel it's just about to fall, but look, it hasn't yet. That was a picture taken in 1997. I have another one there now. That's 1997. And then this is 2013, so you can see there has been a deterioration and a bit further deterioration since that as well. But it's absolutely beautiful. But I believe that the Busteed family lived. Let's go back there. So you can see a house there to the right of the photograph. That is probably the house where the Busteeds lived. But I mean, the address was always given at Mount Long Castle. The Mount Long estate passed to Giles's eldest son Luke, who married Martha Jeffson of Mallow Castle. Now the Jeffsons were a very important Anglo-Irish family, so this marriage would have improved the social status greatly of the Busteed family. And in fact, Luke was granted the right to use heraldic achievement, or in other words, to display his coat of arms. So, that wouldn't have been happening in the family a generation beforehand. Luke's eldest son was named Jeffson Busteed, and that was a name that was carried down through the generations. We have 6 Jeffson Busteeds in total in this branch. They were all highly educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, and at Trinity College, Dublin. They were a clergyman, an MP, attorney, barrister, apothecary, and of course they were extensive landowners as well. A curious thing happened in 2021. Chiswick Auctions in London advertised a memorial ring for sale, and it was described as a hairwork and pearl memorial ring circa 1780. The oval ivory plaque applied with a raised urn formed of hairwork and decorated with half-seed pearls, the reverse of the plaque engraved. Jeffson Busteed died 12th of June 1779, aged 29 years, polished band. So memorial rings they're finger rings, and they're otherwise known as mourning rings, and they're worn to commemorate a loved one who has died, and often contain a strand of hair, as in this case, that there somewhere is Jeffson Busteed's hair on the urn. Jeffson himself, born 1750, he was a barrister, and he died at 29, having recently inherited the Mount Long estate. He must have died suddenly, as he didn't leave a will. But he recently married, and living in Dublin. He had his practice in Kildare Street, and he had 3 small children, a boy called Jeffson and 2 girls. And Jeffson, the baby, died a few years after his father, but the 2 infant daughters inherited Mount Long Castle. But Jeffson's death had severe repercussions for the Mount Long estate, because it was seized by a cousin, Michael Busteed, immediately after Jeffson's death. And in time, Jeffson's daughters grew up, and they and their husbands mounted a legal challenge on Michael Busteed, and his family, they were still resident in Mandurong. And the dispute rumbled on until 1832, it's like over 50 years. And then the estate went bankrupt, and Mandurong was just lost to the Busteed family forever, and the lawyers got the money. So, to cut a long story short anyway, the memorial ring was purchased in 2021 by Steve Busteed, who's one of the Australian cousins, who's very enthusiastic about his family tree and his connections to Cork. And the ring is in Australia at the moment, but Steve is a very regular visitor, and he hopes to visit again next year. And the plan is to give it on permanent loan to the Kinsale Museum, so that it can be viewed by any other Busteeds who happen to come, and there's a lot of them now. We have a kind of a constant pilgrimage. I'm called on my tour guide services are called on very often. So, back to this again now. Just I'd like to just tell you just very briefly now. I just run through the main branches of the John Busteed, the brother John, who I have separated. This is just my own classification. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 branches in Ireland. And these would have sort of been established around 1800 or so. There would have been the root of most of those. Now I can connect them back further, but just for ease of management, these are my branches. So going back to John Busteed, who was born in 1602, he acquired farms at Ballinray and Killingley, which are both near Carrigaline, and he and his descendants were wealthy landowners and successful farmers, and the land remained in the Busteed family for several generations. I think it was in the 1830s, 1840s that the male line failed in this case. Between 1700 and 1800, this branch became heavily involved in the commercial life of Cork City, and William Busteed and his son Michael were each mayor of Cork in 1747 and 1799 respectively. In the late 1700s, many of this branch were merchants, attorneys, sheriffs and freemen of Cork City. And in the early 1800s, the penal laws, which prohibited Catholics from owning land and entering the professions, were still in place, but they were not heavily enforced in some areas. So a moneyed Catholic class developed, and marriage between Protestants and Catholics became more common. And it was after this time that I suppose the Busteed family grew considerably and became a lot more prolific. And in fact, I have a long a collection of Busteed baptisms from both Church of Ireland and Catholic, and I have twice as many Catholic baptisms as I have Church of Ireland, but they would all be in the 1800 onwards, obviously. So the principal sub-branches the principal sub-branches of John's family were starting just in Chigila. I'm just going to run through these very quickly now because you probably won't be all interested in very much of it. But Richard Busteed, born 1725 in Cork City, acquired a farm in Chigila. His children and grandchildren served in the British Army in India. One became a renowned economist in England, another was Master of the Mint in Calcutta, a third a surgeon in Edinburgh. But Richard's other sons married Catholic ladies, and they ended up in small farms, I'm afraid, and had large families, and were forced to emigrate at the time of the famine. Now that branch of the Busteed family is gone in Inchigila now, but is thriving in Pennsylvania. Two separate branches, and they were here in 2016. The Bandon-Nisafuka branch, which is the Abraham Busteed who I mentioned earlier, who may be connected to Inchigeelagh, probably is. And that this is so John Busteed, he was a tenant farmer in 1800, but his great-great-grandsons still farm that same land in Bandon today, which is very nice. There are 2 farms there, and a branch of that farm, the family went to Toronto, Ontario. The Bandon Town branch, which is not closely related at all to the other Bandon branch, but they had a farm that went bankrupt in the 1860s. The whole family moved to Belfast, and they're still there. So then we have Slieve Row, which is a townland very near Kinsale, Balgooly rather. This is a family scattered quite widely, including Nebraska, that I mentioned beforehand, and Tom Busteed and Carrigaline and his relatives. So there's a lot of them around Kinsale. If you meet, Carrigaline, if you meet Busteed and Carrigaline, that's the family. William Busteed married a Catholic and was banished to Australia with £300. And his descendants still thrive in Victoria State. And then, of those who remained in Ireland, then Frank Busteed was a well-known Republican soldier in the Irish War of Independence in the 1920s. Now the Ballinray branch is interesting. They're a little bit colourful. And as I said, Ballinray is outside Carrigaline, and I call them the Ballinray branch because they're the people who hung on in Ballinray and farmed the land. Lieutenant Christopher Busteed, Lieutenant Christopher Busteed started off as a hero. He was at the Battle of Waterloo, and he was made a free man in Cork in 1815 for his gallant conduct at Waterloo. But in 1870 he was connected to the North Cork militia, and in 1817 I suppose he needed a new assignment, and he was the officer on board a convict ship, the Chapman, who was sailing to Sydney with 200 male prisoners. So there were 5 crew members on board. He was the only military one, and there was the captain and the others that were sailing the ship. But his job was, I suppose, to keep the peace, which obviously he did not succeed with, because there was 12 dead and 28 wounded by the time they arrived in Sydney. And so the entire crew was arrested and put in the next ship back to England, where they were tried at the Old Bailey in London. And now they were acquitted, which was kind of a foregone conclusion, because they were, agents of the British government. But he came home apparently in disgrace. He died in Mullingar at the age of 35. He was still a lieutenant and unmarried, and he seems to have come to a bad end, really. I was unable to place him on the family tree until, coming up to 2016, I put a call out for any artifacts or any books or paintings or anything that we could use as in an exhibition at our gathering. And this man got back to me. He was a Busteed from the Ballinray branch, and his mother was a Busteed. He lived in England, and he had various bits and pieces. He said, "I'd like to offer you," and I said, "Thank you, that'd be lovely." And he said, "Oh, and there's one other thing." He said, "I have a sword here," he said, it's come through the Busteed family. I don't really know what it is, but somebody suggested that it was used in the Battle of Waterloo. I said, "I know exactly what that is." So anyway, I said, "Send me a photograph." So he did, and subsequently he brought it with him actually to the gathering. And I did a bit of research on it, and apparently, like, the British Army had different designs of swords, or for their different regiments or their different campaigns. And the sword that James had was the same sword that the officers used in the Battle of Waterloo. So I'm pretty convinced. But then that it's the same one. But then I thought, well, where did he get it? It could only have come through his direct family line. So I kind of then was able to guess where to put him in the family tree. And then I was able to corroborate that, using other facts that I have. So I'm pretty sure now that I've got him in the right place. Going back to the Ballinrea branch, during the famine times, this family was forced to emigrate. Toronto, Victoria in Australia, and Llandudno in Wales was where they went. Another interesting thing about this branch is that they were heavily intermarried with the Daunt family, who are another English family that are based around the same area near Ballinrea, in the Kinsale, Carrigaline, Crosshaven area. And there were these Busteeds and the Daunts they were heavily intermarried, with obviously arranged marriages, because there were several farms that passed over and back between the two families as dowries. And coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, I'm not from this branch, but I'm also married to a Daunt. And when we were getting married, my father did some research, and he was able to tell us that we were the 19th Daunt Busteed married couple since they came to Ireland, which is pretty incredible. And as my father said in his wedding speech, that I was the first Busteed bride to marry a Daunt that didn't have a farm to bring with them as a dowry.
She had a rock.
So anyway, unfortunately, the male line from this branch has died out in Cork, so you won't meet any Busteeds who are part of this. Although through the female line, there's loads of people. Yeah, you're one of those, are you? My line is the Fountainstown line. And there was a family of Busteeds with several sons who were born around the 1800s. And again, that branch is not there anymore, except again, coincidentally, I live in Fountainstown too, in the farm next door to where they came from. With that, again, well, you wonder really, is a coincidence, but I mean, there was no plan to do that. My branch migrated to Cork City, to Mayfield actually, and another sub-branch of the Fountainstown group went to East Cork, and then there was others in California, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, but the most prolific again was Michael Busteed, who left Fountainstown for Newcastle, Australia in 1841, and has loads and loads of descendants there in Australia today. And our last branch then, which is kind of a little bit different, the ones who went to Canada. They went to Canada in between 1754, I think, originally was the first that William Busteed went to Canada. But it appears that he and his brothers went there by choice to advance their careers and to seize opportunities. And between 1760 and 1776, Captain William Busteed fought for the British in the American War of Independence. And then he got a land grant, sounds familiar, in Restigouche, which is in the province of Quebec. And as I say, there's 7 generations later, they're still there. William was joined by his family members in Canada over the following decade. And interestingly enough, the land in Restigouche that was in the property of the Busteed family for 7 generations has just been returned by order of government to its previous indigenous owners. That was in 2009. So the Canadian government bought it back, and I mean the Busteeds are still living locally there, but they no longer have their estate. Imagine 7 generations later. Cousins of those Canadian Busteeds were printers and newspaper proprietors in Tralee, and they published the Kerry Evening Post. And between 1827 and 32, the Tralee family and the Quebec family had a business partnership. They owned a ship called the Busteed Brothers, which sailed between Tralee and Cork and St. John's in Newfoundland. So this was pre-famine, but they carried immigrants to the New World, and the ships returned to Ireland twice or 3 times a year, laden with timber. Unfortunately, their ship ran aground in Cork Harbour in 1832. Now that's not the ship, that's the same type, the same model of ship. That would be what it looked like. So that's just, oh yes, the other thing, the last bit about the Tralee family, eventually they crossed the Atlantic themselves and settled in Maryland and New York, where they published newspapers. And noteworthy individuals include George Washington Busteed, who was Chief Secretary to the Governor of the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean in 1828, and his sons Dr. John Busteed of New York, prominent doctor associated with Cornell University, and Judge Richard Busteed, who served in the Union Army in the American Civil War and was the U.S. District Judge of Alabama. So they did quite well. So that's all I have to say about the history of the Busteed family. But I just want to, just before I finish, just tell you a little bit about the tools that I used and how I approached this. As I say, was the volume of information and the challenge of putting it all together. And when I started working on it, this was long before, you know, it was before internet, so there was no support from, I wasn't involved in any groups or anything. I had to make it up as I went along. But as I say, between my dad and myself, we have created a fairly good database at this point. I mean, we're dealing with large amounts of data. As you all know, you have to be very organised. And the databases, the Excel and Word, are searchable, which is very necessary. And we have information in various categories, such as census records, civil records, council records, co-op records, deeds and land, education, professions, military, newspaper, oral history and wills. And there's decades of research in those databases, and I continue to add information as I find it from whatever source, but you know, you really have to keep on top of it and continually maintain it. And I think my database is really the cornerstone of my family tree research, and it's my box of jigsaw pieces, really. Go back to that analogy. Ancestry, I create trees on Ancestry. I really love using it because, I mean, once you've got used to it, it's really easy to use, and I love that it finds all the basic information for you, and it sets it up in chronological order, so you don't have to waste time doing all that basic stuff. And I add every piece of information I have in fine detail to the individuals in my family tree. But I have 2 problems with Ancestry, and the first is that when I started off, I was constructing lots of individual ancestry trees because I didn't know how the branches were related to each other. So I'd say I have about 20 family ancestry trees, but it was a while before I realised that I can't merge them. Ancestry doesn't have that facility. So even though I might know how the branches relate together, I can't relay that to Ancestry, and I just have to kind of keep it in my head, you know. If I'm trying to look up a certain individual, I have to just remember, oh well, they're from that branch, so they must be on that tree. Which is, I hope that Ancestry will update that and solve that problem. Then my second problem with Ancestry is that it's very hard to visualise the overall layout of the family tree. I'm a visual learner, and if I see the information in a tree format, my mind can absorb the relationships between the various generations and so on much more accurately than if I was reading it by text. But with Ancestry, you're looking at the detail of it. And what I used to do was I used to make out my own hand-drawn charts and to be using those in conjunction with the detail of the whatever individual I'm looking at. But that's very unsatisfactory because when you, I'm sure everyone has this problem when you find a new member of the family or you want to move somebody around, you can't push people sideways because it's handwritten. So I needed to find a way to do what I really wanted to do, was to do what my grandfather did, or what my father did, to be able to create a tree and to put in individuals and to put in whatever little facts I wanted underneath them to make, that would jog my memory or that would be interesting and so on. And I just found it very hard to source something online that I could, digitally that I could do that. But I did eventually come across Apache Open Office Drawing, and I don't know if any of you have used this, but it's fabulous. And it can be downloaded free from the internet, and it's a drafting package really for the drawings. But it's very. What I use it for is very basic. Do I have? Yeah. So that would be a typical example now of one of my open office trees. So it's very easy to make these little boxes and to draw the lines and so on. It's very, very basic. And in this case, this guy just had so many descendants. I was trying to figure it, like I can sort of look across there and okay, Cork, Crosshaven, Ohio, Indiana. Then these people in red are the people who had offspring themselves. And again, I was able to kind of, customize it to what I was looking for. So I have about 20 trees, 20 open office trees, and I use them to complement the ancestry tree. That's the way I work, and I just found it really, really good. Very early on, even when I thought that Busteed was a very relatively rare name, I realised that if I was going to have any chance of managing the data on the family tree, that I'd have to follow the male line only. Because if I went to branch out along the female line, the things would become chaotic very quickly. So in my tree records every person who's born with the surname Busteed, whether they're male or female, but it doesn't continue on the female line. So Busteed daughters are included, but not their offspring. So for example, my name is on the tree, but my children's name are not, because they're not Busteeds. And this goes against the grain for me, as I think for any female genealogist. But at the same time, if you're to create a meaningful story, there's nothing you can do about it really, unfortunately. So I've had to live with that, live with my conscience in that one. So this here is the what I'm calling the universal family tree. Over the years, my confidence increased that all the Busteeds today are descendants of old John Busteed from Gloucestershire. So this is the descendants of old John Busteed. So in 2024, prior to the Busteed gathering in Pittsburgh, I felt I'd gathered enough information to make an attempt to produce a single Busteed family tree encompassing all the male descendants of old John Busteed. But it took me a long time to figure out how to do this. The first thing is, how big a piece of paper would I need so that it would be legible? So this is actually, I made this out on Open Office, and it's 5 A3 sheets side by side. And I created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I had to do a lot of calculations first of all, and how many would I need? Because if I was to, it would be very awkward if they, I needed to know how many individuals that I could fit on one page, and it took ages to do it. But look, I managed there, and I stitched the 5 then together, and I got it printed obviously professionally. KWP did it from Carrigaline, and they put the 5 sheets together. There's about 1,350 people on this chart. So this one here was 53, so it's gone from 53 to 1,350, which is quite nice. And I think I've got, obviously it's still a work in progress, but I think I've accounted for most of the Busteeds, certainly the ones that I've come in contact with. 95% of these connections are based on proven links, or at least evidence, but I had to make a few assumptions about particular relationships because I just didn't have the proof. But I've highlighted these in dashed lines, with dashed lines, so this is all subject to a revision if needs be, you know, so you're very welcome to have a look at it afterwards. The other thing is that I've colour-coded the individuals to reflect their country of residence. So the blue ones are Irish, as you can see, the earlier generations are blue, but I mean, it's amazing how few Irish Busteeds have made it down to the current generations. So we have greens, United States, Canada is orange, and Australia is yellow. So, you know, so we've got a lot of Americans here, a lot of Australians over there. And but you know, they're all mixed up as well. You know, we think sometimes it's particular families went to particular places, but that doesn't seem to be the way it is in this place. So I think that my universal family tree is a visual representation, I think, of the social and geographical movement of one family over the course of 15 generations. And as I say, it's still a work in progress. And in fact, since I got this printed, which was last year, I have had a few changes. You know, I've updated them on the soft copy, but you know, obviously I can't be, you know, running copies of this very often. So, just to conclude, I mean, the Busteed family history is the story of a colonial family. But it's also very much a Cork story, and everything about the family and the diaspora relates back to Cork. And I think that Cork colonial history is not often focused on or not identified with by people in Cork. But you know, when it comes down to it, like the Busteed family was part of the social fabric of Cork for 400 years. And I just feel that it's a story that needed to be told. So thank you very much.